You're probably very confused at the title of this video, and wondering why I would say such a controversial thing about such a great game. Well, lucky for you, I'm going to be using this video to elaborate on that statement, and tell you why I think that way. Breath of the Wild is a massive breakthrough in the Zelda formula, and some would even consider it a complete revamp of the system as a whole. They're not wrong for saying that. Everything that makes a Zelda game, got flipped on its head for this entry. All of your main abilities are given to you from the start, allowing you to run free as soon as you leave the Great Plateau. Obviously, in previous entries, this was not the case, as the sense of progression came from obtaining the items and upgrades as you progress through the game. Though it is obvious that this formula was being experimented with a little bit in A Link Between Worlds, where you could rent all the main items from the start, and do all the dungeons in any order you want. Speaking of dungeons though, in Breath of the Wild, the same principle is applied on a much larger scale, with shrines and divine beasts. You can do every single dungeon in any order you want, or not do any at all, barring the 4 shrines on the Great Plateau. This is a big change to make, and comes with a lot of things to think about. Obviously, this couldn't be pulled off perfectly the first time. There's going to be some growing pains, and staleness is one of them. That's what I want to talk about today. I actually was going to make a Creating the Best Sequel episode about this game, and include this discussion in it, but I thought this specific topic would fit better in its own video, as it's already been talked about before on other channels, and we're expecting more info on the sequel to Breath of the Wild relatively soon now, so I'll save for that video till then. But as I was saying, Breath of the Wild starts to feel quite stale after a while, and it's because of the dungeons. I personally have some input and suggestions that may be different from what others have proposed, so let's talk about it. First, let's talk about shrines. Shrines contribute to the main sense of progression in the game once completed, rewarding the player with a spirit orb. Obtaining 4 spirit orbs allows the player to increase either their health or stamina capacity by praying at a goddess statue. These mini dungeons are scattered all throughout the map, and there are a total of 136 shrines in the game, including the DLC, of which only 124 of them award spirit orbs. However, the concept of shrines are fine, that I have no problem with. I really like the small scale puzzles that can be completed in short bursts of gameplay. It suits the concept of the Switch really well, and I'm sure they considered that during development. My problem arises with the aesthetic look of the shrines. They all look the exact same. Shrines are created using ancient Sheikah technology, and their buildings have a very distinct look, which actually are inspired by the Homon period of Japanese history, meaning rope or cord pattern. During this period, it was a popular Japanese practice to use ropes or cords to create the designs on various things such as clay pots or urns. This type of design is very apparent in the Sheikah's creations, on everything from the Sheikah slate, to the shrines, to the towers and divine beasts. It's great that there is continuity between these structures, and it fits very well within the story of the game, but that doesn't necessarily mean it was the best idea to use that same design in every single dungeon of the game. Except the Yiga Clan hideout, if you want to count that as a dungeon, as well as the final dungeon, Hyrule Castle, which is a whole different conversation. It would have been much better to see each shrine given its own personal identity. The only thing really distinguishing each one is the puzzles presented in each, and even then there are very few that stick out. Every shrine sort of blends together, in my mind at least. I see that as a problem because each dungeon is supposed to be memorable. Each one should have its own quirks and gimmicks that go beyond the puzzles alone. Now, I don't want to lean too much on referring back to previous Zelda games, as I think that this one is in a league of its own, but let's talk about some dungeons from them to better help illustrate my point. The first one that comes to mind is my favorite Zelda dungeon of all time, the ancient Cistern from Skyward Sword. This dungeon is, well, a cistern, which is an area used for collecting and storing water, and it's a very large one at that, with many water-themed puzzles, lily pads dotting the surface of the pools, and other aquatic stuff such as pipes and water wheels, all topped off with a huge statue in the center. However, there is an underground section to the dungeon as well, conveying a much darker aesthetic. Down here, cursed bokoblins roam, and even try to pull Link back down when he is trying to escape the lower area of the dungeon by climbing up a spider's thread. Additionally, in Twilight Princess, I want to reference the Arbiters Grounds. Located deep in the Gerudo Desert, the Arbiters Grounds were used as a prison to house Hyrule's greatest and most dangerous criminals while they await trial. During the events of the game, the undead wander the chambers of the prison, along with other monsters. The dungeon concludes with a battle with Stallord, a reanimated skeleton of a dinosaur-like creature that is possessed by the powers of the main antagonist of the game, Zant. In Breath of the Wild, there are only two dungeon themes, the Shrines and Divine Beasts. The Divine Beast's purpose were to protect the people of Hyrule and fight against the anticipated revival of Calamity Ganon during the Great Calamity 100 years before the main game. And Shrines were built 10,000 years ago by the Sheikah as trials for the hero to train them for their battle with Calamity Ganon. Which, yes, are pretty unique and cool ideas at first, but that's all you get. Each dungeon in the other games has some sort of story or significance attached to it, and there are way more than two of them. This analogy could even lead into a discussion of the problem of the bare-bones story in Breath of the Wild, but that topic is way more subjective in nature, so I'll save it for another video. Let's talk more about the Divine Beasts though. There are 4 of them, each corresponding to one of the 4 major regions of Hyrule: Eldin, Gerudo, Lanayru, and Hebra. They were originally piloted by the 4 champions, Daruk, Urbosa, Mipha, and Revali, who died fighting the Calamity 100 years ago. After they were defeated, Ganon's malice of the Calamity corrupted each Divine Beast, turning it evil. And that is the reason that Link has to enter each one in the events of the game, to destroy the malice infecting the Divine Beast and reclaim its power to help defeat Ganon. Cool story, right? Sure, but once again, that's not really where my problems lie. Every Divine Beast shares the same aesthetic, just like the Shrines. Although, I would argue that this aesthetic is even more dull than the Shrines. They are very brown for the most part, with the only color variation coming from the malice spread across the dungeon. Even the bosses all share the same general look, which once again is coherent with the story, since the Blight Ganons come from the same creator, but also once again doesn't necessarily make it a good choice. And no, I am not saying that these shrines or dungeons are bad mechanically. They all contain very interesting and unique puzzles that make excellent use of the robust functionality of the Sheikah Slate, especially the final dungeon in the Champion's Ballad. I just wish we had more diverse themes and eye candy between dungeons to really set them apart from each other. The Divine Beasts blended together almost just as much as the Shrines did for me, with the only distinguishing factor of each being the main gimmick of each one, whether it be wind, fire, water, or electricity. There is one dungeon, however, that I did like much more than the others, and that is the Trial of the Sword dungeon, also known as the Sword Monk's Shrine. In this dungeon, themes of areas around Hyrule were pasted inside of the dungeon, such as the grassy plains of Hyrule Field, to the beaches of Lurelin Village, and even some snowy areas of Hebra. I really appreciated the variety and aesthetic setups in this dungeon, even if they weren't exactly unique, because at least I had something new to look at every once in a while. However, the walls and the ceiling were still shrine themed, which makes sense, and this variety in aesthetics was definitely a step in the right direction for dungeons. Just about every area of Hyrule is visited in this dungeon in some way, shape, or form, and the environment is used to make combat more difficult in some situations. I think that this same aesthetic that the Trial of the Sword used could be applied to all the shrines as a simple fix, and lucky for you, I've got actual video footage of this idea put into action. Let's take a look at a currently in development mod for Breath of the Wild titled Second Wind. This mod aims to overhaul every shrine in the game to offer up more variety and aesthetics, among countless other things, such as adding a whole new area and questline that takes place after the Champion's Ballad. But I'm getting way ahead of myself here, so let's go back to those shrines. The Shrine Overhaul project is well underway, with many of the shrines already being done, and as you can see, the only real changes were to the environment and atmosphere of the shrine, incorporating parts of the outside world into the actual dungeon. It actually bases the aesthetic of the inside of each shrine on the area the shrine is located in Hyrule. For example, the Cryonis Trial Shrine, which is on top of the highest mountain on the Great Plateau, is now littered with snowbanks, and the temperature has been dropped significantly, simulating the climate of the world outside. This concept is applied throughout the entire Overhaul mod, basing the shrine's theme off of location and even including a few new mechanics based upon that same thing. These tweaks wouldn't even involve creating new dungeons, it simply adds already created textures and assets into the shrines to mix up their feel and give each one its own identity. But we still haven't talked about how we're going to fix the Divine Beasts. Sure, we could just put some of the outside assets inside the Divine Beasts just like the shrines, but that doesn't exactly make sense. The Divine Beasts are moving machines and not stationary structures. It wouldn't be feasible that trees, rocks, and other parts of the overworld would be located inside of these beasts. Something else would need to be changed. If each Divine Beast had its own aesthetic look and feel, mainly on the inside, I feel like it would have helped a lot in distinguishment, as just like the shrines, the only thing setting them apart was the puzzles and the mechanics of the boss fight. However, because of the robotic and mechanical nature of the Divine Beasts, modifying their interiors to look different from one another would be a little much. So maybe it would be best just to scrap that type of dungeon entirely. Granted, this would mean that the story would no longer make sense or be cohesive, but let's just think about design for now. If traditional dungeons, and when I say traditional, I'm using that term very loosely, basically only referring to the theming and aesthetics of the dungeon, if traditional dungeons were in Breath of the Wild, scattered across Hyrule, able to be completed in any order, just like the Divine Beasts, would it have been better? Would the staleness and blending together of each dungeon go away? I personally think so. There was nothing necessarily wrong with having this type of design philosophy when it came to dungeons, and since it was the staple for so long, Nintendo definitely just wanted to try something new. And they did, and it worked for the most part. I just want to reiterate again that the dungeons in Breath of the Wild from a puzzle solving and mechanical standpoint are still phenomenal and live up to the standards set by the many games that came before it. But none of that really matters if you're so tired of seeing the same theme that you don't even go to the Shrine of the Divine Beast in the first place. Nintendo tried many new things with this game, with most being good and some being not so good. It just goes to show how careful you must be when you mess with something that isn't exactly broken. Thanks so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed, please leave a like as it helps out a ton, and if you want to see more content like this, consider subscribing as there's tons already on my channel and plenty more to come. Have a good one, guys. Peace.